roar of motorcycle engines ripped through the silence like a pack of wild animals closing in on their prey. Standing beside his dusty old pickup truck in the middle of a deserted highway, 90-year-old Henry didn't flinch. Frail and bodied but sharp as ever, his hands trembled, not from fear, but from pure, simmering fury. The gang of bikers had him surrounded, their black leather jackets covered in skull patches, their laughter sharp and mocking. One of them, a cocky guy with a sneer plastered across his face, revved his engine louder. "What's wrong, Grandpa? Forget the way back to the nursing home?" More laughter. More jeers. But Henry didn't react. His face, worn by time and battle, remained still. His eyes, however, burned with something the bikers were too busy laughing to notice. Then, without a word, Henry reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old flip phone. That sent them into another fit of laughter. "A flip phone? Oh man, what are you gonna do with that? Call your knitting club," one of them cackled. Henry ignored them. His fingers, knotted with age but steady with purpose, pressed the keys. He lifted the phone to his ear, his voice low and firm. "It's me. I need you here. Now." Before the bikers could process what was happening, a new sound broke through the chaos, the distant hum of approaching engines. Not motorcycles. Something bigger. Stronger. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado wavering. Henry snapped the phone shut, slipping it back into his pocket with a smirk. "You're about to find out what happens when you mess with the wrong old man." Just hours ago, it had been a normal day for Henry. He had spent his morning tending to his backyard garden, his hands deep in the soil, nurturing tomatoes and squash, ingredients for the stews he was known for. After lunch, he decided to take his old 70s pickup into town for supplies. The truck sputtered to life as he set off down the long, empty road. The solitude of the drive reminded him of younger days, road trips with friends, endless laughter, and the kind of freedom that now felt like a distant memory. Then, in his rearview mirror, he noticed them. At first, he thought the bikers were just passing through. But when they started tailing him, weaving too close for comfort, something in his gut told him this wasn't random. When he pulled over to let them pass, they didn't. Instead, they stopped too. Henry stepped out, leaning on his cane, watching as they dismounted. 7 of them, each more menacing than the last. Their leader, a burly man with a shaved head and a scar cutting across his cheek, was the first to step forward. "Afternoon, Pops," he said with a smirk. "Need some help finding your way?" Henry's grip on his cane tightened. "I know exactly where I am." That response didn't sit well. Another biker stepped closer, grinning. "Got yourself a tough guy, huh?" The tension escalated. Insults turned into threats. One of them even kicked a dent into Henry's truck, laughing as the old veteran's jaw clenched. They had no idea who they were messing with. Henry had seen war. He had faced real danger, real fear. A few punks on motorcycles? That was nothing. His voice cut through the taunts like a blade. "Enough. You boys have had your fun. Leave now, and we pretend this never happened." The leader took another step forward, towering over him. "Or what, old man?" Henry didn't blink. He just reached into his coat and pulled out his phone. They thought it was funny. They had no idea what was coming. Henry hadn't always been alone. His late wife, Margaret, had been his world. After she passed, life had gotten quieter, emptier. His kids lived out of state, visiting when they could. But there were still a few people he could count on. One of them? Frank. Frank was an old war buddy. A man of few words, but endless loyalty. The kind of guy you call when things get serious. And that's exactly what Henry had just done. The approaching engines grew louder. The bikers stopped laughing. The atmosphere shifted. The bikers, once smug and laughing, turned their heads toward the growing sound of approaching engines. Their expressions twisted from amusement to unease. "Who the hell did you call?" the leader demanded, his bravado slipping. Henry just smiled, a faint but knowing smirk. "You'll see." The low, rumbling noise grew louder, distinct from the rough roar of motorcycles. This wasn't just one or two vehicles. It was a fleet. The bikers' cocky smirks started to waver as a convoy of black SUVs and trucks crested the distant hill, kicking up a thick cloud of dust as they closed in fast. The lead SUV skidded to a stop just yards away from Henry's truck. Then, doors opened in perfect unison. Men and women in plain black tactical gear stepped out with calm, calculated movements. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Their presence was sharp, efficient, something that didn't need to be announced. It was felt. The tension became suffocating. One man, broad-shouldered with a neatly trimmed beard, strode straight up to Henry. "Colonel Henry." His voice was crisp, his posture snapping into a perfect salute. "Apologies for the delay, sir." Henry returned the salute with a slow nod, his expression calm, but his eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. "You're right on time, Corporal." The bikers stood frozen, their bravado dissolving like mist in the sun. The leader, once so cocky, took a step back. His voice cracked. Who are these people?" Henry didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gave a slight nod to the corporal. That was all it took. The corporal turned, barking a sharp command. The tactical team moved like clockwork, spreading out in a way that left no room for argument. Two of them approached the bikers, expressions unreadable. The leader's hands shot up in surrender. "Hey, look, we don't want any trouble." Henry exhaled slowly, his voice laced with steel. "That's funny. Because a few minutes ago, trouble seemed to be all you wanted." The bikers exchanged nervous glances. The leader tried to find his footing, his voice turning defensive. "Look, man, we didn't mean anything by it. We were just messing around." Henry tilted his head slightly, his tone razor sharp. "Messing around?" He let the words hang in the air. "You dented my truck. You harassed me. And you thought you could intimidate an old man." He leaned forward just slightly, his eyes locking onto the leader's. "Tell me, does that sound like messing around to you?" No one answered. One of the bikers tried inching toward his motorcycle, but before he could so much as grip the handlebars, one of Henry's men stepped in his path. A slow shake of the head was all it took to make the guy freeze. The leader's frustration boiled over. "This is ridiculous. We didn't do anything that bad." The corporal's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Then let me make something clear." He took a step forward. "When Colonel Henry calls, we answer. You're lucky he's handling this as calmly as he is." The bikers paled. "Wait, Colonel?" "Like military," one of them stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry's lips curled into something between amusement and warning. "Retired colonel," he said, "but the people I served with, they don't forget their own." The leader swallowed hard, his confidence gone. "Look, we're sorry. Seriously. Just let us go, and we'll never bother you again." Henry stepped forward, leaning slightly on his cane, his presence somehow heavier than ever. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, he spoke. "You'll leave now. But not before you fix what you've done." The leader blinked. "Fix what?" Henry tilted his head toward the truck. "That dent," he said. "You're going to fix it. And you're going to do it right." Or, he let the weight of his words settle before finishing. "We'll have another conversation." The bikers hesitated, but the corporal wasn't in the mood for negotiation. "You heard the colonel." His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "Get to work." Grumbling under their breath, the bikers got to it. They patched up the truck as best they could while the tactical team stood watch, their unreadable expressions making it clear any wrong move, and things could get a whole lot worse. The leader tried to argue a few times, but each time, Henry silenced him with nothing but a single look. As they worked, Henry's thoughts drifted. Margaret would have told him to give these men a second chance. She had always believed people could do better if given the opportunity. He wasn't sure if these men deserved that chance. But for her, he would try. When they finally finished, the bikers stood there, awkward and uncertain, waiting for Henry's judgment. He inspected their work, gave a small nod. "Now get out of here." His voice was quiet, but the weight of it was undeniable. "And if I ever see you around here again," his eyes locked onto the leaders one final time, "we'll have a very different conversation." They didn't need to be told twice. Scrambling onto their motorcycles, they fired up their engines and tore down the road, disappearing into the horizon. The tactical team began dispersing, but the corporal lingered. "Anything else you need, Colonel?" Henry shook his head. "Just good to know you're still out there. Ready when I call." The corporal gave a small smile. "Always, sir." As the convoy disappeared down the road, Henry was left standing beside his truck, the setting sun gleaming off its hood. The silence returned, but something in his gut told him this wasn't over. The days passed quietly. Henry kept himself busy, tending to his garden, sipping coffee on the porch at sunset. But something gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. The sense that what had happened on that highway wasn't truly over. Then, one afternoon, while polishing his old military medals, a ritual to honor his fallen brothers, he heard it. A single motorcycle engine. He froze, the cloth in his hand motionless. The sound grew louder. Then another. And another. Until the distant hum became a full-fledged chorus of engines. Henry moved to the window, parting the curtain just enough to see the road. A line of motorcycles rolled in slow, deliberate formation. They weren't just passing through. They were here for him. His jaw clenched. It wasn't the same gang from before, but their leather jackets and the way they carried themselves made one thing clear: this was bigger than just a few punks. The bikes rumbled to a stop at the edge of his driveway. The riders dismounted, each move careful, deliberate. But one stood out. Tall. Long gray hair. A face carved by years of hard living. He didn't wear leather like the others. Instead, a faded army jacket hung on his broad frame, patches still intact. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Henry's house like he was daring him to step outside. Henry didn't hesitate. He grabbed his cane, opened the door, and stepped onto the porch. The sun cast long shadows across the yard as he met the man's gaze. The stranger's voice was calm, almost casual. "You're the one who scared off my boys." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Name's Jack. But people call me Commander." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Commander of what? A pack of thugs?" The other bikers shifted, bristling at the insult. But Jack lifted a hand, silencing them without a word. That alone told Henry everything he needed to know. This man wasn't just another gang leader. He was something more. "They told me about you," Jack said. "Said you had a team show up out of nowhere. That's not something a regular old man pulls off." Henry's lips twitched into a faint, almost amused smile. "I'm not a regular old man." Jack nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Figured as much. That's why I came to see you. I don't like loose ends." Henry's grip on his cane tightened. "If you came here to threaten me," he said, voice like steel, "you'll find out real quick what a mistake that is." Jack chuckled. "Relax, Colonel. I didn't come here to fight. I came here to talk." Henry tilted his head slightly. "Talk about what?" Jack stepped closer, the light shifting over his withered face. His voice dropped lower, losing its earlier amusement. "You've made enemies. Big ones." Henry's eyes remained steady, but inside, he was weighing every word. Jack continued. "The boys you ran off? They weren't just some local punks. They've got connections. People who don't like being embarrassed. Henry's voice remained even. I didn't embarrass anyone. I defended myself. Jack smirked. Doesn't matter. To them, it's personal now. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Henry spoke. Why are you telling me this? Jack hesitated. Then, with a small shrug, he said, because I don't like cowards. He glanced toward his crew. Those boys disrespected you. And when things didn't go their way, they ran crying. His jaw tightened. That's not how I operate. Henry studied him, searching for deception. But he found none. So what's your play here, Commander? He asked. Jack smirked. Let's just say I like to keep things fair. If they're coming for you, you deserve to know. What you do with that information, that's up to you. With that, Jack turned on his heel, walking back to his bike. His men followed. Engines roared to life. Then, as quickly as they came, they were gone. Henry stood there, watching the dust settle. The road was quiet again. But his mind wasn't. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at his old flip phone. Jack's words played over in his head, over and over again. He knew what they meant. The bikers weren't done. They'd come back. Stronger. Smarter. More prepared. Calling Frank and the team again was an option. But he couldn't rely on them for everything. This was his fight. And if they thought they could push him around, if they thought age had made him weak, then they were about to learn a very different lesson. Henry stood. He walked to the living room, to the wooden chest that had sat untouched for years. He knelt, ignoring the protest in his aging knees, and unlocked it. Inside lay pieces of his past. Old uniforms, photographs, and the tools of a soldier's trade. His fingers hovered for a moment before gripping the weathered duffel bag. He unzipped it. Inside, gleaming despite the years, was a carefully maintained collection of weapons and gear. Memories flooded back. Hostile territory. Nights on watch. Missions that never made the history books. The weight of a rifle in his hands, the quiet understanding that sometimes a fight was unavoidable. Henry exhaled slowly. He wasn't just a retired colonel. He was a soldier. And if they wanted a war, they'd get one. Then, a sudden knock at the door. Henry's instincts flared. His hand, still resting on the sidearm he had just unpacked, tensed. Moving quietly, he approached the door. Peered through the peephole. Not a biker. It was Emma. His neighbor. Kind-hearted. Early 30s. Always stopping by to check on him. Henry opened the door, his hardened expression softening just slightly. Evening, Emma, he said. She hesitated, glancing toward the road. I just wanted to check on you, she said, concern flickering in her voice. I saw some bikers. Henry held her gaze for a moment. Then, ever so slightly, he smiled. Come on in, Emma, he said. Something told him. Things were just getting started. Henry forced a tight-lipped smile. I'm fine, he said. Just a little misunderstanding. Nothing to worry about. Emma didn't look convinced. If you say so, she said slowly. Then, after a pause, just, if you ever need anything, let me know. My husband can come by if you feel unsafe. Henry appreciated the offer. But this wasn't her fight. I can handle myself, he said, his tone firm. Emma gave him one last concerned look before heading back toward her house. Henry watched her go, then slowly closed the door. He leaned against it, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He wasn't about to drag anyone else into this. This was his battle. And if he had to fight it alone, so be it. As night fell, Henry sat in his darkened living room. The duffel bag rested at his feet, unzipped and ready. His fingers traced the familiar cold steel of his sidearm, an old companion from a life he thought he'd left behind. The silence was deceptive. Then, just past midnight, the sound came. Soft at first, like a whisper carried by the wind. Then louder. And louder. Not one bike. Not two. Many. Henry stood, moving with the precision of a man half his age. He grabbed the duffel bag, slung it over his shoulder, and took his cane in his other hand. As the roar of engines grew closer, he slipped out the back door, vanishing into the shadows. From behind the barn, he watched as a convoy of motorcycles pulled into his driveway. At least a dozen riders. This wasn't the same ragtag group from before. These were professionals. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head and a tattoo snaking up his neck, stepped forward, his voice cutting through the stillness of the night. "Colonel Henry," he called. "We know you're in there. Come on out and let's have a little chat." Henry stayed hidden, his eyes narrowing. They were armed. Pistols on their hips. Bats and crowbars slung over their shoulders. This wasn't intimidation. This was an ambush. The leader's voice came again, sharper this time. "We don't have all night, old man. You can come out and make this easy, or we can come in and make it hard." Henry let out a slow breath, a smirk playing on his lips. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Slipping into the barn, he moved toward his old workbench. It had been years since he'd used it for anything serious. But tonight, it would serve its purpose. From the duffel bag, he pulled out a set of tripwires, flashbang grenades, and other tools of the trade. His hands moved with practiced efficiency. Decades of muscle memory kicking in like second nature. Outside, the bikers began to fan out. Their boots crunched against the gravel as they spread across his property. "Check around back," the leader ordered. Henry crouched by the barn door, waiting. The first trap was set. A narrow path leading to the barn. A tripwire, nearly invisible in the dark. Two bikers approached. "You see anything?" one of them muttered. "Nothing. The old man's probably hiding inside." Then, a boot caught the wire. Click. A blinding flash. A deafening bang. The two men hit the ground, clutching their ears, crying out in pain. Chaos erupted. "The hell was that?" the leader barked. Henry used the distraction. Slipping from the barn, he moved toward the house, staying low, his movements swift and silent. Another pair of bikers was inspecting the barn, their backs turned. Henry crept closer, his sidearm raised. "Anything in there?" one of them called. No sign of the... He didn't finish. Henry stepped from the shadows, his gun leveled. "Hands up," Henry said, his voice cold and steady. The bikers froze. Their hands slowly rose. One of them glanced toward his holster. Henry shook his head. "Don't even think about it." "Look, man, we don't want any trouble," one of them stammered. Henry's gaze didn't waver. "You brought the trouble," he said. "Now you're gonna help me end it." He motioned for them to walk ahead, using them as cover. As they reached the driveway, the leader turned. His eyes widened. "What the hell?" he shouted, drawing his weapon. Henry shoved one of the bikers forward, using him as a human shield. The leader hesitated. His aim wavered. "Drop it," Henry commanded. For a moment, the leader considered his options. Then, slowly, he lowered his weapon. But his voice carried a warning. "You're just delaying the inevitable, old man. There are more of us than you can handle." Henry smirked. "We'll see about that." Then, a low growl cut through the darkness. The bikers stiffened. Their flashlights swept the yard, landing on a pair of glowing eyes. Then another. And another. The pack emerged. Teeth bared. Hackles raised. Henry's neighbor, Emma, had always warned him about the stray dogs that roamed the woods nearby. Most people avoided them. But Henry? He had a way with animals. Over the years, he'd earned their trust, leaving out scraps of food, fresh water during dry spells. Tonight, they were repaying the favor. The bikers backed away, their confidence cracking. Hey, man, one of them stammered. Call them off. Henry didn't say a word. He just smiled. And in the moonlit silence, the pack moved forward. The bikers' confidence crumbled as the snarling dogs closed in, driving them toward the driveway. One of them panicked and fired a shot into the air, but it only made things worse. The sudden noise sent the pack into a frenzy. The bikers scattered, some jumping on their bikes and speeding away, others fleeing on foot into the night. The leader was the last to go, his face twisted in fury as he revved his engine and tore out of the driveway. Henry watched them disappear, his expression calm, but his mind already racing. This wasn't over. They'd regroup, come back stronger. He had won the battle, but the war had just begun. As the engines faded into the distance, Henry knelt, calling the dogs over. They hesitated at first, their wild eyes still on edge, but as he patted their heads and murmured words of gratitude, they softened. He stood and looked out over his land, the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. This was his home, his sanctuary, and he'd defend it with everything he had. The next morning, Henry surveyed the damage. A scuffed barn door, a few shingles knocked loose, and a shattered kitchen window, a small price for holding his ground. Repairs didn't bother him. He'd been fixing this house since he and Margaret first bought it. But Jack's warning still echoed in his mind. The bikers were connected, and they wouldn't take this loss lightly. By afternoon, Emma stopped by with a warm smile and a casserole dish. "Thought you might like some lunch," she said. "You didn't have to go to all that trouble," Henry replied. "It's no trouble," she said, setting the dish down. Then her eyes flicked to the patched-up window. "What happened?" "Just a little accident," Henry said, avoiding her gaze. "Nothing to worry about." Emma frowned, unconvinced. "Henry, if something's going on, you need to tell me. You don't have to deal with it alone." He softened. "I appreciate it, Emma. But I've got it handled." She sighed but didn't push. Instead, she sat with him while he ate, chatting about her garden and the new fence her husband was building. Henry appreciated the company, though his mind remained elsewhere. After she left, he got back to work. He dug through the old wooden chest in his living room, pulling out maps, blueprints, and a field radio that, despite its age, still worked. Hours were spent marking defensive positions around the property, setting traps, creating choke points. If the bikers returned, they wouldn't find him unprepared. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Henry walked to the woods at the edge of his land. The dogs had returned, lounging in the shade of the trees. He brought them a bucket of leftovers, kneeling as they gathered around. "Gonna need your help again, boys," he murmured, scratching behind one of their ears. "More trouble's coming." The dogs seemed to understand. Their eyes sharp, bodies alert. That night, while Henry prepared, the bikers regrouped at a rundown bar on the outskirts of town. The leader, still seething, slammed a beer bottle onto the table. "I'm done playing games with that old man," he growled. "Next time, we finish this." One of his men hesitated. "You sure about that, boss? He's not exactly normal. The way he handled us, it was like he was trained for this." "He's just one guy," the leader snapped. "We outnumber him. We've got better weapons. We take him out and send a message to anyone else who thinks they can stand up to us." Murmurs of agreement spread, though unease lingered. They all remembered the dogs. The traps. The calculated way Henry had dismantled them. But loyalty, or fear, kept them in line. Then the bar's door swung open. Jack walked in. Silence fell. He approached the leader's table, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. "You're making a mistake," Jack said evenly. The leader scowled. "What are you doing here, Jack? Thought you weren't part of this anymore." "I'm not," Jack said, "but I know what's coming if you keep pushing that old man. And trust me, you don't want any part of it." The leader sneered. "We're not afraid of some washed-up vet." Jack leaned in, his voice quiet, but lethal. "You should be." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Jack straightened and walked away, leaving without another word. The leader let out a forced laugh. "He's just scared," he muttered. "But we're not."